Severus told me that chemically, magically it should work. The potion should fool the parasite within Remus into reproduction and at that point exterminate the larvae. Charming. He looked at Callias. I got the primrose root, I found a way. And it is contained therein, nodded Callias. The ingredients are correct, it's been cross-checked. I will remember to thank Cecilia Lupin tomorrow night for saving my brother's life. So, you're coming tomorrow night? James asked, when he could stand the silence that Cleus's last statement had invoked. To the party at Grimmauld Place? You'll stay, not just drop off Septimus? I believe so, nodded Cleus, repocketing the amber vial. Then on Boxing Day there's the premiere of the Quiball, Bannerman, Quakely, Hieronymus ... Ronaldo, Giggs, Gerard ... Aberforth's legacy bears fruit, Bellatrix is a genius. Yes, eventually, I will be there, agreed Callias, folding his arms. I am to meet Cecilia, Severus is bringing Septimus. He closed his eyes, the warmth on his face a balm to the almost intolerable feeling of stress and strain being relieved, in part, by the wizard standing in front of him. I have a long night, rest, Callias. You have no need to escort me to Hedgewoods. Things are quiet for now. There's hardly been anything like any attacks since before Halloween, and the Witten ... Can you spare yourself an evening longer for the Quiball? Callias turned his head to James, a smile on his face, something his muscles had almost forgotten how to do. Quiet is just an absence of open animosity, thought Callias, cynically. Quiet should not be confused with peace. Severus's meetings are never of any great length, nodded Callias, feeling as if his mind had been drained, and a measure of calm was enveloping it. You have a lot to consider. Continue to keep Rod Lestrange informed, even if it is quiet. He looked at the now unofficial head of reciprocators and added, I appreciate your consideration, my friend, but no. Not now. Later, perhaps. And James Potter disapparated, leaving the head of the ministry mulling the imminent future as yellow flames greedily consumed another pine log. 88,888,888. The visit to the Natural History Museum had been brilliant. They had gone early to London's shops, with the coloured lights and festive displays and, while Septimus had stepped off train the evening before, tired from travel and dull from worry, the drive to Mr. Scott's brother's house, where he would be staying with them for a few nights, had replaced those of desperation for the next couple of days to pass quickly so he could be with Mum in the Lake District and having Christmas with her, with feelings of euphoric festivity. It's so Christmassy, Opal had exclaimed for about the 20th time that day, as shoppers, milling about, buying the last-minute bargains, greeting one another, walking about and chatting happily, had exuded the essence of the season. In Marks and Spencer on Oxford Street, Mrs. Scott had helped Septimus choose a present for his mum, a sparkly gold top and matching jewellery. Mrs. Scott has said that she had met his mum once, and that was about her size, but if she kept the receipt Mrs. Lupin could return it for a different size. Mr. Scott had then found them and had urged them on to the museum, promising lunch at the restaurant there as an incentive for their expediency. It didn't take much for Julian to hurry. The museum was within walking distance, and surprisingly busy for Christmas Eve, and Mrs. Scott had supplemented their lunch with almost every conceivable delicacy that the Lake District had to offer: butter, cheese, cake, and Kendal mint cake, she declared, her voice dropping as Mr. Scott brought over the food, slipping the three children a bar each of pure condensed sugar flavored with mint, as Opal's father put in front of her a large cake with 8 candles on. You wouldn't think we'd forget, now, do you? Asked her father, as Julian's sister grinned from ear to ear. Look, they even managed to ice a beyond for you. Opal was, in the same way that Julian and their father were keen on rocks and minerals, deeply interested in insects, and she had received an apiary for her birthday, something she had woken the house with that morning with her excitement at such a present. At home, there was plenty of space in their garden for it, and was promised that when she was older she could have beehives, if she looked after the bees in the apiary properly. "I am really looking forward to watching the Quiddball match on Boxing Day," said Mr. Scott, when they were making progress with their lunches. "To think, we saw the first one, Maureen, at your school, Julian?" Julian and Septimus grinned at one another, both remembering the Halloween games, where Mr. and Mrs. Scott had indeed spectated, and the attacks by conjurists had led to them, along with a lot of other parents, sleeping overnight in the room of requirement. "It's going to help all over for sports," he continued. "Lots of footballers are getting into it, those not signing to leagues, and so on. The same with Quidditch players, they're setting up together. It's going to be an up-and-coming sport in years to come." "Quiddball," thought Septimus, as he tucked into his cabbage and carrots. The Scots had bought them all a roast turkey dinner, which was, as these things usually are in restaurants at Christmas time, turkey instead of chicken, with a range of vegetables, stuffing and gravy, with the option of things like cranberry jelly and roast chestnuts, things you just didn't get at any other time of the year. "What sort of traditions are there in your family, Septimus?" Mrs. Scott had asked, and Septimus had told her that Christmas was pretty much the same as in non-wizard families. "Mum's a non-wizard. And we go to church," and then everyone laughed and chatted about Christmas, and their favorite part of it, and things they remember, including Mr. Scott explaining how he got a large cut all down the lower part of his left leg where he and his friend had gone out sledging when he was 13 in large snowdrifts in the countryside round Coniston, and had come off and got entangled round a tree. After a long afternoon in the museum, where they had seen everything from mummies, dinosaurs, the statues of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and, eventually, the large collection of minerals and rocks, they had eventually got back to Mr. Scott's brother's house at around 9, just enough time for a bite of supper and to hang up their stockings. Opal had been enthusiastic, demanding first go at hanging up hers so that Father Christmas would see it first. Julian and Septimus were a lot more cynical and had played along for Opal's sake. Once their beds that night, in the very top of the house, with the lights out, Julian asked Septimus about his dad. "Do you wonder what Professor Snape meant when he said that your illness was hereditary?" It had been something that had been on his friend's mind, Septimus could sense, and in the mostly darkness, mostly because the curtains were illuminated by the orange glow of the streetlights outside, he turned over in bed towards his friend. He could feel his face redden under the cover of darkness as his soporific mind sprang to alertness at the mention of the condition that Severus Snape had told him about, and he, in turn, had told Julian. "I don't know. At least I can ask Mum tomorrow. I am looking forward to seeing her so much." "I know." There was a pause. Only, you know I'm your best friend, right?" "Right." Septimus's voice trailed off. What was Julian trying to say? They'd chatted that evening already about his parents, and Julian had counselled him about his dad's absence and how he would explain to his mum he hadn't got his lightning shot, which she had spent all her money on for him. "What's this about, Julian?" he asked, pointedly. "You know when you were ill. You were in the exact same bed that I was when I was ill." "Yes," nodded Septimus, sensing his friend's point was not about hospital beds. "I visited you, and, one night, I came down to see you after hours, and I heard the professor talking to Madame Pomfrey talking to Professor Snape." "Oh. Right. He said ... I heard him say ... the illness, the lycanthropy that you had, was hereditary, rather than you being bitten, like Darren's uncle? Who had gone out with your dad that day and was bitten by a werewolf." "Sirius Black?" "Yep. Julian shuffled under his duvet. There was a long pause. Whatever Julian was trying to tell him was clearly awkward. What I'm trying to say is, if Professor Snape is saying your lycanthropy is inherited, so you won't actually be a werewolf, where did it actually come from? Who did you get it from? Well, began Septimus, then stopped. It was a good point, and one he had not yet thought about beyond the fact he had the same condition as his Uncle Kay, who was the only werewolf he knew. Even then, Severus Snape had made him a potion to prevent his spontaneous transformation. And had been bitten. He didn't inherit it from his father, Septimus's grandfather, who was also his dad's dad too. Dunno, Jules. I'll talk to Mum, I guess. It's a lot to take in. But hey, thanks. For what? For telling me. Lycanthropy, inherited from somewhere. What about his dad's ancestors? Or his mum's? She was a non-wizard, as were her parents. But if there was anything he had learned about the universal link was magic skipped generations, like hair color, and if there were twins in the family. Perhaps it was from his grandparents, or great-grandparents. Night, called Julian, in the darkness, which made Septimus, who was dropping back off to sleep, wake back up sharply. Night. September? Yeah? It's after midnight. Merry Christmas. In the darkness, Septimus smiled. Today he would see his mum, and see Dad, and have Christmas with his family. Merry Christmas to you too, Jules. 88,888,888. It was just after midnight when Harry and Hermione began to move from the sofa, from which they had been watching their Christmas film. The evening had been really lovely. Hermione had got back home, early for one, from Strasbourg. Harry too had been able to slip away from the Era office, from where he was doing a large amount of historical research in place of his mum. A good deal of paperwork to that respect had been brought home and Benet duly filed in a pile in the cupboard under the stairs. As they watched the film that evening, Out of Africa, one of Hermione's favorites, his mind wandered to the last few messages that had been flying around the Era office, from Dave Mullen, cabinet link to the Eras. They had been asked to note any incidences of where magic had been used and to cross-reference them with any conjurist attacks. Not that there had been many conjurist attacks recently, since the wit and even the likes of Swales and Bluewit had been keeping their noses clean. But another phenomenon had been on Harry's mind that afternoon. Following their morning debrief by Herbert, they were to report with any attacks the magical energy levels. It seemed there was less of a magical footprint at places where these attacks took place than other places where wizards and non-wizards met, significantly so. Callias would be on to that like a bloodhound on a fox trail. Harry had thought that afternoon. Any patterns in magical activity and the Minister for Magic would take a keen interest. But that's his job, said Hermione, when he had mentioned it to her that afternoon, like some things are my job. You'll see, when you move to Strasbourg with me. I'm glad you agreed with me, that it would save money towards the wedding. Callias says only temporary. He felt Hermione snuggle next to him as the film had played on and Harry had thought, but temp things sometimes have a way of becoming permanent. And he knew that he wouldn't like to move there permanently, as lovely as the city was. Anyway, all of that felt a long way off with Christmas now surrounding them. Over dinner, Hermione had asked if he had seen Ron, and what his Christmas plans were. He's still seeing Freya. He says they'll be seeing each other over Christmas. How about when Cecilia comes back for Christmas? Hermione had asked. A forkful of ham and cucumber. Who knows? She's happy with Ron, it seems. Yes, things did seem to be happy. And he was happy for him and Hermione too. How lucky he was to be with her, and they had a future together, and good jobs. There was a lot to be happy for, in their own future too. They are invited at Christmas, Dad said, to Grimmauld Place. Oh? "That'll be great," replied Hermione. "Only, won't Dudley be there, with his family, too?" "I shouldn't think that would matter," Harry had replied. "That's been over several months. My cousin doesn't dwell on these sorts of things. Anyway, he'll be pleased enough with his promotion. He's working with his dad on the Flu Network. There's a lot on with that, and the ministry work is keeping them busy. He relaxes easily, does Dud." "Hopefully all of them are relaxed tomorrow," conceded Hermione, clearing up the dinner and dishing out a steaming rice pudding. "I spoke to your mum, but all she seemed to be concerned with was the collaboration of the reciprocators with the NWRs." "It won't be the NWRs," sighed Harry, "it'll be one NWR in particular." "Petunia," they'd said together. Anne laughed. That Lily and Petunia Evans had never seen eye to eye was an understatement. "It's helped I got some of her work, but—" "Yes? But, I dunno. Dad said she'd been acting strangely recently, not like her usual self." "She's been through the mill recently with Sam," Hermione had reminded him. Harry's mind came back to the present, just after midnight between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, as the credits of the film rolled. "Time for bed," declared Hermione, untangling her limbs from Harry's. "You aren't staying up to do anything with that lot, are you?" Past the Christmas tree, Hermione pointed to the partially ajar understairs cupboard door, which would not close because of the vast amount of paperwork from Harry's office. "Nah," said Harry, striding over the living room floor and into the hall, stooping to scoop them all up. Hermione knelt to help him. After a couple of minutes her hand rested on a pile of things and she seized one, then another, looking them over in disbelief. "I thought I'd thrown this out," she declared, "and that one." "Just a moment." Harry looked at what she had in her hands. Cecilia's notebooks, The Story That Never Was, Old Magic. "Or, you could just put them back," suggested Harry, innocently. Harry looked at him suspiciously. "Harry, I've thrown this book away 3 times, and this one, in fact all of these, only for it to reappear in the house." "Magic?" suggested Harry, trying not to sound too enthusiastic. "Or perhaps there's something you'd like to tell me?" She put down what was Cecilia Lupin's notebook and looked at the pages, which were blank. Giving Harry another doubtful look, she leafed further in, only to find more blank pages, and then one which did contain some writing. She stared at it and Harry craned over, trying to read it, but it faded from the page as if the paper itself was absorbing the ink. "What you have in your possession is no mere diary. It is access to someone's thoughts, past and present." The words that Severus Snape had said to him the night he had visited and made Harry promise to look after the books trotted themselves over his cerebellum. "Well," he began, defeated. There was no harm in Hermione knowing, the thought of the warm fuzziness of sleep now well abandoned. "Cecilia Lupin," he began. "They belong to her. Severus Snape left them here for safekeeping." "But I distinctly remember burning them," exclaimed Hermione. "Biblion Flamore," declared Harry, in wonder. "There is a spell. There must be a spell protecting them. It doesn't matter if you destroy them, they'll reform as they once were. Phoenix magic." "And how is it continuing to write?" asked Hermione as the words appeared on the page, existed for a second, then were absorbed by the paper. "Strong, deep magic," Harry replied, vaguely. "I didn't perform it, maybe Snape. Maybe Cleus Lupin? And how long must you take care of it?" But, before Harry could answer, below Hermione's hand, the page darkened, as if being covered from edge to edge, corner to corner, in black ink, the pages crinkling around the sides and near the spine. "Snape said I should bring them to him, and I would know when." But before Hermione could continue, the book vibrated under her hand, hissing and writhing like a lobster in hot water. "I don't know," said Harry, staring at the book. "They've never done that before." "Shall we put them back?" suggested Hermione, who went to pick up Cecilia's journal. It was at that point when the pages flicked open to the blackened ones and the screaming started. 8,888,888. Despite her last lesson being 2 days ago, Cecilia Lupin, Professor Lupin, teacher of non-wizard studies at the Durmstrang Institute, had spent the freezing, wind-lashed days preparing work for the Durmstrang students. As fervently as ever she had known, they were spending their pre-Christmas time not considering family, festivities and fun but, rather, work, focus and studying. At least that way, Cecilia rationalized, she wouldn't be bombarded with questions about holiday learning schedules if she was prepared and planned for them. It allayed their fears and worries. It made her stop the feeling of anxious excitement in her stomach at finally seeing her son and, Cecilia thought, the third thing. The thing she must get over that night. The thing the students had been told they must attend, must relax for, and at which with their presence they must honor their school, the school ball. Climbing the stairs back to her bedroom, having dropped off the last pile of work in the correct out trays by her classroom, labeled as they were for the appropriate year groups, Cecilia heaved it open, stepped wearily in and closed it behind her. Done, her mind thought to herself, as she took a few steps back, leaning against the thick paneling for support. That truly is the end. No coming back here, whatever Cleus Lupin wants. She smiled at the thought, as the rain and sea spattered the windows again and again, being swept by high winds. And, she would have to go out in that, her mind thought as her heart sank. A lot of her things would get soaked unless she could wrap them well. But that wouldn't be till later. First, she needed to Cecilia reached to her head, her hair having grown quite a lot since the summer, when she had chopped it to ear height. Now, her hair was limp and in need of a Washington and a good hairdresser to get it halfway neat for a ball. At least, she had some time now. It was only 4:30. And Ragnhild had promised she would help her out with restyling something she had. It would work, anyway. It was only a ball. So why was she feeling self-conscious about it? Focus, Cecilia, you old fool, she told herself, as her incidental magic managed to get herself a halfway hot bath next door. Focus on what's really important, getting down the steps to the harbor, on that boat, and back to Yorkshire. Focus on what you need to take. Think about Septimus and Remus, and what you'll say to Severus Snape when you meet him. Think about getting to Edgeford and planning your way out of this mess and getting your lives back together while Remus is in hospital. A knock on the door of her room came sharply and interrupted her train of thought. Cecilia stopped the train in a siding and called out, "Yes? It's me, Lindveld." There was a pause. She couldn't very well let him in. And, well, she hoped to heaven he wouldn't come in. "Cecilia? I'm just in the bathroom," she shouted, hoping he could hear her through two doors. "All right, well, I came to say that I would call that 7 for the ball." When she didn't answer immediately, he added, "Did you hear me, Mrs. Frobisher?" "You said you'd call that 7, Mr. Halen," called back Cecilia, having gulped a mouthful of soapy water. That only gave her 2.5 hours to make herself look less like some old woman. "Thank you," she added, wondering whether he'd gone, "and see you later." "Yes." His voice came again. "See you later." Having got out of the bath with rather more haste than she had got in it, Cecilia wrapped her hair in a towel, her body in another, and pulled on Petunia Dursley's jumper over the top, pacing over the cold stone floor towards the door at speed, opening the lock and latch and pulling it open. He had gone, she thought, with a touch of relief as she told herself as she closed the door. Then she turned her back to it and leant against it, crossing her arms over her chest, her mind filling with thoughts racing, and she screwed up her eyes. This was so wrong, she thought, as Lid's brown eyes and chestnut hair invaded her visual consciousness. His long nose and fingers, which she had so often noticed when he'd held his wand aloft, or pointed things out to students when he had taught. His soft, reassuring voice. Was she all right? How did she feel? Questions that made her feel, well, like a person again, rather than a mother, rather than a non-wizard, rather than a dash. A wife. Remus, still in St. Mungo's, still ill, caused a shiver across her shoulders. She was still here, technically. She had been working for him, of course. That was why she had spoken to Lyd, discussed things with him, watched him work on things she could not. He had done so much for her. Of course she could repay the favor to Lindveldhalen. She would go. Even thought she was 13 years older than him. Like he was a younger brother, as she had described to Petunia. She was helping him out. So why did she still feel so wrong about it? Cecilia returned to the bathroom, where it was relatively less cold, towel drying her hair and pulling on some pajama bottoms for the moment to go with her warmest sweater, as she dragged out the case that was under her bed, where her book was stored with the refinements for Remus's potion were, where the match and base for Harry. She had it pictured in her mind only for a few minutes on the day that Cleus had forced her back to Durmstrang, almost immediately after she had said goodbye to Septimus at King's Cross, on 1st September. The rails had barely had time to cool down before he was telling her that her belongings were already at Durmstrang. Outside, in the stone passageway, feet were stepping, and Cecilia froze. It was never 7 already. She waited for a knock on the door, but it didn't come. The footsteps grew quieter. Other wizards and witches, Ragnhild? Perhaps not. She tended to excuse herself from large groups of people as the seeing upset her. She and Cecilia had excused themselves from the last 2 Christmas balls on that basis. But not tonight. If she thought of Lindveldhalen as a little brother, perhaps that would make it easier. Because after tonight, she needn't see him again. Others were making their way now to the formalities that were Christmas Eve at Durmstrang that year. Doors below and further along the gloom-filled corridor opening and closing told the tale of all the staff of the institute preparing for tonight. She had been awestruck at actually how many staff there were at the school. Cecilia had attended the formal school meal before the children, working up to the last minute as they had chosen to do, were expected to mark the season with a dinner and speeches. If that has been anything to go by, this evening would also be filled with talk of exclusivity, hard work, toil and reward of the wizards they would eventually become, before instructing them to return home for the season and continue with the school's teachings of discipline and high expectation as they represented their families for a short time. Several of the students did choose to remain at the school, and it had increased last year compared to the previous. Many of the teachers returned home, so the students weren't able to access lessons, but at least they could search in the library, or use their leisure time, as well as practicing Quidditch to perfect essays or speeches. Inside her suitcase was little of merit, nothing at all that would be fit for a formal occasion. A short-sleeved suit blouse and trousers that she wore for teaching was the smartest that she could find, nothing in the dress department, and, because of lack of time to dry it properly, she would have to wear it up. As for makeup, forget it. She had never thought she would socialize and never wore any. Dressing quickly, she criticized her appearance, and not constructively. Another decade and she would look like her mother, only with redder hair, though with definitely as many wrinkles. No. It was no good. Cecilia closed her eyes. She would have to tell Lyd that she couldn't go, and he would have to bear his dislike of the event as best he could. Opening her eyes, Cecilia expected to see the image she had just banished by closing them, and was about to step towards the bed to undress and put on something more comfortable. Stop dead. Her hair. It was longer than even she had remembered, and curled slightly so it bobbed down as ringlets from her crown. Her dress, a flattering turquoise, cut advantageously around her hips so it flared out and fell in soft waves. The stole on her bed was trimmed in turquoise and gold lace, and, on her feet, A small-heeled pair of open-toed slingbacks. How? Ragnhild stood in the doorway as she turned. The white blonde witch, a few years older than Cecilia, was wearing a floor-length silver gown which sparkled as though covered with diamond. Her figure slender, she had silver shoes to match the dress, and her hair was fixed with bluebird-shaped clips. Pale blue stones adorned the decoration. Ragnhild? You cannot go to the ball in anything other than the finest, Ragnhild began, smiling happily. Nor I too, Sissy. I cannot help you with the decoration of your thoughts, however. Whether you go is your decision. But if you do go, you will at least look your best. Cecilia stepped, carefully, towards her friend, the ability to walk in the small heel of her shoe a little difficult as she was so out of practice. She looked at her friend's face, seeking the answer which she knew would not come. I am expected. But, following the speeches and dancing begun, I expect to return to my room. Please may I take this chance to wish you a good Christmas time, Sissy, and that all you wish for comes to pass. Your gift, she added, indicating Cecilia's appearance. I have nothing for you, Ragnhild, only my friendship. You shall always be dear to me. You should only ask should you need anything. I am likely to be going home soon, and I can keep you informed of Crystalia. The older witch sighed. Only if you are able, Sissy, that would be gift indeed. The communications black out. But if you use my fire, Ragnhild, I know of a way. Indeed, nodded Ragnhild. I will be sure to use it, of course, and should you have news of Crystalia, I will be indeed glad to receive it. Now. The graceful witch took a step back, her eyes looking Cecilia up and down, critically. One more thing for you, and you will be perfect. Out of bag she pulled a necklace, a large, oversized gold filigree heart, which seemed to contain a red stone underneath. She slipped it around her neck carefully, then looked at her again. Perfect. Cecilia felt her eyes look down. It was beautiful. And she would be sure to return it to the witch before she left. Her eyes took in the detail again, as her mind was trying to work out where she had seen it before. Thank you, it's such a lovely loan. But, perhaps it was not her own necklace which was familiar, but that of Ragnhild's. She had wondered how it was that the witch would be able to stand the presence of so many people. And then she realized, she had made her watch stone into a necklace. Ah? You noticed the detail? Yes, indeed, I will attend tonight, although I will not be able to bear it for too long, a few hours, or so. Enough for the show of propriety. Cecilia smiled. Ingenious work from a witch whose condition made her suffer so. Crystalia's is from the same rock, it is from our home, from Iceland. The whole of the island is made of it, and keeps Naruto safe. Safe up here, she added, waving her hand towards her temple. Many a truth-teller has lost his mind without it. At least her country will keep her safe, she added, smiling wanly at Cecilia. If only I could go with her, and see her once more. Can't you? Asked Cecilia, if the rock will keep you sane, like you said? Oh Sissy, it is not as simple as all that. In my community, in my country for a truth-teller to have a daughter this means you are cast out, banished from your home, your lives, your people. What? Cecilia exclaimed in shock. It is unfortunate. Crystalia is still pure, and as such will receive her visions without the horror I suffer. My mother was the same which is why I was compelled to leave Iceland before this so-called gift drove me to madness. I am a lucky, Sissy. I can use academia as a salve, and Cleus Lupin was able to afford Crystalia a place at Hedgewood's. She's going back to her father's family for Christmas, for Yule. So, it's worse because you have a daughter? Cecilia felt her mouth was still open, agog. Because I have a child, yes, Ragnhild sighed. Having a daughter is the fate of a Naruto. It is passed down through the female line. I exiled myself before the shame of my own expulsion from my family, shame that my mother had to endure. I would not wish that on Crystalia, the shame I had to bear. And yet the last thing my mother said to me was that I, too, would be in the same position she was in. I was horrified, of course, but vowed to control the circumstances in which it happened. It did not stop me from loving her father. It did not stop me from his family taking me into their home and treating me like a daughter, risking exile too. The 10 years before Crystalia was born was the happiest time of my life. I studied, we traveled. And then, when life seemed only too perfect, my visions became intolerable and the words of my mother came to my mind. I knew I was expecting a daughter, and so to save the honor of Sigurd's family I made plans to be away, legitimately, with dignity. Something my mother could not. After she was born, my darling girl, pure as the moonlight, innocent as the sun, I spent more and more time away. The Brants stepped in to raise her. I could not have asked for better parents-in-law. But she gripped Cecilia's lower arm, staring into her eyes deeply. I miss them, every day. My darling Sigurd. His parents. Their home, which was our home, near the coast. What else could be done? My mother died of madness, rejected by her family for her gift. I was brought up with the stigma and shame of truth-telling in my nature. It's better to know, than not know. Cecilia did not know what to say, and rather, said nothing, drawing the beautiful, flawless, slim, ice-blonde-haired, pitiful woman to her, holding her close, feeling her long, sorrowful sighs against her own body as if the woman was letting go some inner sadness. It is Crystalia's fate, too, whispered Ragnhild, as they broke apart. When she leaves school I plan to visit home one last time to tell her. She cannot avoid her fate any more than she can escape the tides. But with luck she will have enough life experience and friends around her to soften this cruel fate of ours. Cecilia took her hand, thinking of Sam Potter, who was the girl's boyfriend, of Lily and James. Of Harry and Hermione. Yes, she concluded, there were enough people around Crystalia Brant to care for her when the time came, and, who knows, maybe the curse of truth-telling would not be as terrible for her, being educated at Hedgewoods, with a variety of children. With a different attitude to impairments such as Crystalia had. They had begun to take on non-wizard children, for example. You couldn't get more liberal than that. So I am glad for you, Cecilia Lupin. When you leave tonight, like Cinderella in the story, you will take the boat home to be with your son, her pale eyes shimmering like diamonds. To want to be with your family is a will like no other, I know that. But also, sometimes, their will to stay away to protect them is what you need to find within. Cecilia could feel her eyes widening, but before Cecilia could question Ragnhild on her profound statement, though, a knock came on the door, followed by, Mrs. Lupin? Cecilia? Ragnhild's mouth turned into a crescent at the sound of Lindveld's voice and she got to her feet. Thank you, Cecilia, for all you have done. Listen to me, like no one else could have, she added, answering the question that was only now half forming in Cecilia's mind. And take care. Lightly she paced to the door, her delicate limb guiding her slim hand to the doorknob. She opened the door as Lindveld Halen stood there. The wizard bowed to Ragnhild as the witch nodded, striding by, but, just before she continued towards Durmstrang's great hall, she turned her head, looking at Lindveld for a second, before flashing a smile at Cecilia. Mr. Halen, Cecilia felt herself saying as a flush of color worked its way from her stomach to her chest, to her shoulders and then to her face as the wizard's chestnut brown eyes met hers. He smiled, before saying, "May I come in?" Cecilia nodded, trying to quell the slightly uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. The young man looked beyond handsome, the blood-red and black fur of the Durmstrang dress cloak complementing the dark brown of his robe beneath. He was smiling. "Thank you, Mrs. Lupin. You have afforded me a great favor this evening. And may I say how exquisite you look this evening?" Cecilia could feel her heart beating faster, but she fought to control her feelings. "I think, under the circumstances, you may call me Cecilia," she said, smiling back. "I must just say, though, I cannot stop till the end of the ball." No, I quite understand," Lindveld replied, stepping towards her and, with a nimble deftness, drew his hands towards her shoulders, catching the necklace that Ragnhild had lent her as it fell. "It looks as if the catch is loose," he said, glancing at the ruby-red stone, before withdrawing his wand and aiming it with all the precision of a clockmaker working on the inner cogs of a timepiece, a tiny stream of a spell interacting with the clasp. "Here," he said, holding the necklace in his hand. "It's beautiful," he added, stepping behind her. Then, without warning, Lindveld lifted her hair to one side, fastening the gold chain on which the filigree work pendant hung around her neck, his hands brushing her shoulders. "There," he said, smiling widely to Cecilia, "you look beautiful. Thank you again." He held out his arm. "Dress cloak," Cecilia said clumsily, trying to dash away thoughts of, well, anything from her mind, the wizard's touch on her skin most of all. She looked towards the end of the bed and Lindveld scooped it up, making to put this on her, too. "I think I've got it," said Cecilia, as she took it from him, swishing the heavy cloak over her shoulders in an arc, then fastening it with the 2 ebony buttons at the collar. "There. Shall we be off, Mr. Halen?" "Lindveld," said Lindveld Halen, as he offered her the crook of his arm. "If we are on first-name terms, Lindveld." Scooping up the small bag that was also by her bed, containing both the 2 potions of Harry's and the final notes that the refined Mr. Lindveld Halen had assisted her with, plus the theories that Lindveld Halen had put to her, verifying background energy as she had been involved, and his discovery of her per the foul, splitting his soul, related to Salazar Slytherin. Cecilia had mused on the coincidence, but had dismissed it. Of course Slytherin would have an ancestor who had formulated Horcruxes. But there was no heir of Slytherin here. Or rather there was, but he had had a stable upbringing, lived a life of obscurity and died as an old man. Tom Riddle here was not Lord Voldemort. She took the wizard's arm which he was proffering and allowed him to escort her and the only 2 things she was taking with her home on the boat that night down the corridor to the ball. But they did not turn left, as was the way out of Cecilia's room in the direction of the Great Hall. Instead, Lindveld took her to the right and they walked down the torchlit corridor towards the owlery, the steps down to the harbour and the rocky outcrop where, several months ago he had saved her from certain death as she foolishly had taken the wrong path down to the owlery to send a letter to Septimus. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," replied the wizard, mirth in his voice and, to Cecilia's astonishment, as they stepped out onto the flat path, in the freezing cold, the gibbous moon illuminated it, Lindveld Halen's broom. "I thought we could arrive in style," said the young man, gesturing towards the hovering mode of transport. "But it's only 2 stories down." Cecilia laughed, smiling back at him. "We could walk quicker." Nevertheless, she stepped towards it, sitting side saddle on the wide handle of the sports broom, ignoring the urge that she had, always, when getting onto one of the blasted things to put her feet on the floor as if it wouldn't hold her weight. Behind her, Lindveld Halen stepped over the handle at the back, gripping it with his knees as he took Cecilia around the waist. "Ascendio," he commanded, as the freezing night air caught Cecilia's face, driving the heat of another flush away from her cheeks as the wizard held onto her tightly. Up the broom went, ascending the basalt rocks which made up the staff bedrooms, up towards the Quidditch pitch, the goals driven deep onto the top of the rock and extending out over the tumultuous Norwegian North Sea. "How are you feeling?" asked Lindveld near her ear, as the wind caught her hair that Ragnhild had so neatly tamed, so that it streamed out behind her shoulders. Incredible! She shouted back into the night air, carefree, all measure of inhibition cast aside. It was Christmas Eve, after all. Incredible, she replied again, quieter this time, turning her head towards Lindveld, his face close to hers, his eyes reflecting the moon, his eyes and mouth smiling back at her, clearly enjoying their ride as much as she was. Had this been another place, another time, another reality? Cecilia thought for a second. Just a second. She could be tempted by those smiling lips, too. Hold tight, declared Lindveld, pointing past her and to the quadrangle that was the open space just ahead of them, the great hall square, and he pulled her tightly towards him as he guided the broom deftly over the castle wall and down onto the stone, light glowing from inside the hall. And Cecilia was glad that she had held on. The bump onto the dark, dense granite that made up the square was coming and the landing would be hard. Bracing herself for the bump that was to come, Cecilia closed her eyes, but a bump never came. Instead, like the careful broom handler that he was, Lindveld allowed a broom to gracefully glide up to the bottom step of the great hall, dismounting, and then, offering her his hand, stood next to Cecilia. Patting her hair that was now truly wild and unkempt, Cecilia took it before hesitating as Lindveld made to walk her up the steps. Let me just do something about this, Lindveld, she said, trying to make her hair less haystack and more an hour in the hairdresser's. You look fine as you are, Cecilia replied, but stopped anyway, withdrawing his wand again. As the wizard carefully redid her hairstyle, or at least, did something to make it less like she had gone through a hedge backwards, the light of the moon reflected off Lid's own necklace, a heavy chain next to the collar of his cloak. Cecilia's eyes traced the length of it, but the pendant part was tucked into his robe collar, under which would be his chest. Of course. Cecilia dragged her mind away, by its proverbial shoulders and leading it away hurriedly from temptation. There, declared the young wizard, as Cecilia took her eyes away from Lid, the feeling of nosiness at the wizard's attire melting away as she realized he hadn't noticed her looking at him. Thank goodness. And now, Cecilia Frobisher, Lindveld Halen declared, smiling and offering her his arm once more, to the ball. 88,888,888. As she stepped through the archway of the hall, music. That would be the enduring memory of the evening. Though 21st December, the equinox and, technically, Yule in the Scandinavian countries had passed, the Christmas celebrations here were punctuated with the spirit of Yule, the pagan festival long predating Christianity's celebration of the birth of the Savior. The music was something she recognized, a song about the green forest and the loveliness of the enduring life in the winter. At the doorway fir trees, higher even than the one gifted to London from Norway for Trafalgar Square, rose beyond sight into the high entryway. Candlelight welcomed the guests to the hall, nestling in decorations of fir branches and red ribbon. A lump came to her throat. This was her third Christmas at Durmstrang, but the first ball she had ever been to. In fact, it was the first time she had entered through the great hall's main entrance. For the few times she had been compelled to attend assemblies there she had always slipped in through the teacher's door, on the right, at the back of the hall, through which she had thought she and Lindveld would be entering tonight. The spectacle was a true wonder to behold. Her eye took in the huge basalt columns, set firmly, like guards, in the center of Durmstrang's great hall. Torches burned, a Yule log too, in a huge central fire. In the shadows, at tables, sat students and staff. Tables occupied the end of the hall. Lid's voice by her ear made her realize she had stopped and was gaping around her. "Are you all right, Cecilia?" "Yes," she nodded. "Yes," she repeated more certainly. "To the ball, Mr. Halen." "To the ball," he echoed, laughing, and Cecilia laughed too, her eyes shining in the candlelight from the Christmas tree which loomed to the left of them, at the entrance to the hall. It truly looked as if their hall had been carved out of the basalt rock itself, like a dwarf mine from tales and legends, and the grotto that had been created had been decorated for the season. Mr. Linveld Halen and Mrs. Cecilia Lupin. Their names echoed as both of them stepped over the threshold, and they were announced in. Ahead of her, in the dimness she could just make out Ragnhild's wild blonde hair reflecting the torchlight. Other wizards she vaguely recognized: Mendel Felixson, Anadonis Noeta, Professor of Runes. All of them were sitting, chatting, drinking what looked like wine from long-stemmed glasses. And the evening progressed like that, in a formal, sophisticated manner. She and Linveld sat, they listened to the speeches cordially delivered. They applauded the displays of talent from the students, poetry recital of sagas of long ago from memory, one of which, that of Beowulf, took the sixth-year student nearly an hour to recite. Then, as the evening wore on, and Cecilia felt the nervousness of ensuring she must leave in time for her boat, a dance was announced, for staff. At once, Linveld stood, offering her his hand. "I must go," Cecilia whispered near Linveld's ear, not least to prevent a repeat of this, dancing with the wizard, being in such proximity, his left hand in her right, his right hand on her back, his fingers warm, holding her steadily. "Certainly, Mrs. Lupin. May I escort you?" "Back to my room," she clarified carefully as the music for the dance finished. She stooped by the table, retrieving her bag. It would be a cold journey back to England in this dress, she thought, but at least she would be going, back to her own country, back to Septimus. "Then we shall fly," he chuckled gently. "Tell me when. It will be suicide on your own on the steps, in the dark." Cecilia's pale blue eyes met the deep chestnut of his own, and she laughed too, recalling when he had saved her from certain death when she had fallen on the way to the owlery in her attempt to post a letter to Septimus. "Thank you, Mr. Halen. Tonight has been." Cecilia smiled widely, euphoria coursing through her as he escorted her towards the great hall's door, past the Yule log, having burned much lower since their arrival. "Exquisite. I wouldn't have come if you hadn't have asked me." "No," replied Linveld softly, as they reached the doors, "it is you whom I must thank. Appearances sometimes must be kept, despite how we feel." He leaned forward, his face close to hers. And then he took her face in his hands and pressed his lips to hers. The rush of feeling flowed through her like electricity, although the kiss lasted mere seconds. Linveld looked down at her necklace. The red, ruby-like stone had begun to glow. "Why," thought Cecilia, "why? Just when I had managed to control my feelings for you, and be a dutiful wife, did you go and do something like that?" Then, just as quickly, Linveld stepped aside, as another wizard, who had followed them out of the hall, trod closer. "Mrs. Lupin. It is good to see you. We know you are busy, and have little time available for the finer things the Institute has to offer. I trust that you enjoyed yourself." The wizard glanced across to Linveld, who smiled in acknowledgement. "We have never met formally," continued Wolfgang Brueck. "Although you do attend some of our assemblies." Wolfgang Brueck, thought Cecilia. It was Christmas, after all. Logically, that was the reason that the headmaster of the school was talking to her. So why did she feel so uncomfortable? It was the decorations on the walls that would be it, thought Cecilia. The carvings on the wall, of people being standing on other people, ancient carvings adhering to the wall, a constant reminder to the students here what the school stood for: hierarchy, elitism. Slavery. "It's good to see you too, Professor," replied Cecilia politely, the feeling of discomfort spreading all over her. And she was out here, at the entrance, the courtyard flanked by high, basalt walls on all four sides, Linveld's broom the only means of exit. The only means. You're looking at the carvings? Wolfgang Brueck turned, giving them a cursory glance, before waving his hand in Lindveld's direction. Before Cecilia had a chance to look at his gesture, the huge, wooden doors slammed shut. She turned quickly, wondering why Lindveld would have done that. But it wasn't Lindveld Halen. In fact, he was no longer where he had been. In his place, another wizard, his Wanderloft. Mrs. Lupin, we meet at last? Let me introduce myself. I am the headmaster of the Durmstrang Institute, on leave, currently. My name is Gellert Grindelwald. Cecilia's eyes darted around desperately at the sound of the name, looking for the wizard who had brought her. Surely he could help, or if not, down the steps, back to the owlery, to the boat. She wouldn't be able to get out of the courtyard of the Great Hall without his help, either. She was trapped. There was no escape from here. Oh, I am afraid your time with Mr. Halen is at an end. I do hope you enjoyed your evening. You appeared to be, in any case. The wizard's hair blew in the winter's breeze, his eyes like hot coals in a fire, piercing her gaze as she looked at him defiantly and made to dash past. She felt two hands grip her forearms, bringing her to a stop. No, you will not be slipping off to catch your boat, Mrs. Lupin, or should I say, Mrs. Frobisher, declared Grindelwald, as she struggled in his grasp. It was hopeless, yet there was fight in her still. She tried to swing her legs round and struggle out of his grasp. Pacify! Called out Brueck, behind her, and Cecilia felt her muscles go limp. From her neck Gellert Grindelwald seized the necklace Ragnhild had given to her, the clasp that Lindveld had mended a few hours before breaking again. The second, he declared, with what sounded like triumph in his voice. Recovered again, at last. Albus, you are most careless. Hey! Shouted Cecilia, the only thing her mind could think of saying. That wasn't hers. Mute. Grindelwald waved a hand by her mouth and Cecilia felt it go floppy, like her limbs and muscles had when she had been pacified. Past her shoulder, Grindelwald spoke to Brueck in a different language, perhaps Norwegian? Perhaps Danish? German? And tell Albus, Grindelwald finished, this time in English, as Wolfgang Brueck nodded again, he will be pleased to know he is right. He did bring the third.